gales in 3 centuries sweep through Britain. A cross-channel ferry is beached as the south takes the brunt. The cost of damaged and destroyed homes, who picks up the bill? And Mrs. Reagan goes into hospital. She may need a breast cancer operation. Good evening. At least 17 people have been killed and hundreds injured by the worst storms to hit Britain in nearly 300 years. 1 million homes are still without power, and tonight an electric storm is causing more blackouts along the south coast. Overnight, 2 firemen were killed by a falling tree in Dorset, and 2 seamen are feared drowned off Dover. Others died in road accidents or when parts of buildings collapsed on top of them. 800 people have been stranded all day on 2 sea-link ferries, unable to reach harbour. The cost of repairing thousands of damaged homes is expected to top £100 million. The storm hit the Channel Islands yesterday evening and then moved northeast, with hurricane-force winds reaching the south coast of England at about 11 p.m. By 3 a.m, the worst of the gales were over London and Kent. This morning, the storm moved north and left the coast of Britain at 8 o'clock, heading out into the North Sea.
At one stage last night, Hampshire police said every major road in the county was closed. 1 man died when a tree hit his car. Others simply didn't see the obstacles in time. No one was hurt in this incident, one of dozens of minor crashes all over the south. 2 firemen died and 4 were injured when a tree crashed onto their fire engine. They had been racing to one of thousands of emergency calls. At Barton-on-Sea in Dorset, a family narrowly escaped injury when the side of their flat collapsed. And in nearby Highcliffe, 90 pensioners had to be evacuated when their roof was ripped clean away. Inside, the rooms had been left wide open to the elements. One relative had rushed to comfort her elderly mother. Others told of their terror the night before.
And I heard a crack and a bang and something fell on my bed.
Yes.
And I got right under the bedclothes and right down and covered myself well over. And then somebody called out to us, "Are you all right?" And I said, "Yes, we're under the bedclothes." And we could hear the man in the next flat calling, "Help, help."
At sea, the wind and heavy swell had swept away most of Shanklin Pier on the Isle of Wight. Its rows of amusement arcades had only recently been renovated. And on the Hampshire coast, a cargo ship was swept onto the sand where she stuck fast. The crew could only wait patiently for the next high tide to try and refloat her. Other smaller vessels weren't so lucky. All along the coast, small boats had been torn from their moorings and swept unceremoniously onto the beach. On some parts of the coast, acres of woodland was simply flattened by gusts of wind measured in Southampton at 108 miles per hour. Even the roof of Southampton's new indoor tennis centre wasn't spared. With the wind had come torrential rain. From the air, the extent of last night's flooding became apparent, with dozens of small rivers bursting their banks. The wind has now moderated, but the clearing up's only just begun. James Mates, ITN, on the south coast.
Londoners woke up to find the capital virtually paralysed. Millions had no electricity, no telephone lines and no way of getting to work. And in some cases, the 94-mile-an-hour gales wreaked such havoc that people had to abandon their homes. This tower block was evacuated because officials feared serious structural damage. Falling masonry was a hazard everywhere. A vagrant sleeping rough was killed under a collapsing wall. And this man was badly burned when he lit a candle near a camping gas stove.
I was trying to put the container onto the gas stove and it wouldn't go on. It was near the candle. And suddenly all the gas whooshed out and ignited with the candle.
The gales simply ripped these garages apart. Roofs and walls were scattered all over the place. Residents had to dig their cars out of the rubble, only to join traffic jams picking their way through the debris. Commuters arriving at railway stations found all trains into town cancelled, and people trying to get out of London got no further than the mainline stations. In the city, the big institutions were at a standstill, power failures hit the computers, and the stock exchange stopped trading. The few moneymen who did make it into work found themselves at a loose end as the city ground to a halt. John Draper, ITN, Central London.
In East Anglia, gusts coming off the North Sea at up to 90 miles an hour left a trail of destruction in their wake. In Harwich, the prison ship Earl William, with its 40 Tamil refugees on board, was holed just above the waterline and broke free of its moorings as the storms lashed the coast. Hours later, it was grounded and re-anchored safely. Off the Wash, oil rig workers had to be airlifted to safety when a support vessel drifted dangerously close, threatening to ram the rig. Many ships were grounded in the Thames estuary. Damage is estimated at hundreds of thousands of pounds. Others seeking a safe harbour were escorted through dangerous waters. Coast Guards received calls from more than 300 people who'd lost their boats during the height of the storm. The 40-level gale brought down power cables across East Anglia. 20,000 people were without electricity. Many will be cut off for some time to come. Lorries were picked up and cast aside as the winds blew across the bleakness of the fens. Incredibly, few serious injuries were reported. With rescue services at full stretch, there was little hope of them being righted. The villages were particularly badly hit. Cars were crushed as trees as tall as 50 feet were ripped out by their roots. Farmers joined council workmen and emergency services in their bid to reopen more than 100 blocked routes. But this evening, even the coast is virtually back to normal, with the promise of mere gentle breezes overnight. Judy Laybourne, ITN, East Anglia.
The Home Secretary Douglas Hurd has ruled out setting up a coordinated ministry to deal with future disasters. After a special meeting with other ministers, he said he was generally satisfied with the response to the storm, but all departments will be looking at their procedures.
Ministers arrived to find Whitehall hadn't escaped the storm. They had to negotiate 2 fallen trees to get to their meeting safely, some with less success than others. Energy Secretary Cecil Parkinson told the meeting how the electricity service had coped. Ministers from all key government departments reported on their responsibilities. Home Secretary Douglas Hurd, who chaired the meeting, praised the emergency services and local authorities for what he called their unstinting work. He said Mrs Thatcher sent her congratulations.
Local authorities, emergency services, public utilities, coping resiliently and well. And provided the weather continues to moderate, we should continue to make good progress back to normal.
In the light of this, Mr Hurd said he didn't believe there's any need for a new coordinating body for emergencies. Sarah Cullen, ITN, Whitehall.
One of the worst hit areas was Kent with its ferry ports and motorways. Phil Roman reports.
A trail of devastation swept right across the southeast. One cross-channel ferry is aground off Folkestone. Another is stranded at sea with 150 passengers aboard. Hurricane-force winds of up to 100 miles an hour uprooted thousands of mobile homes along the Kent coast. At the Queen's Hotel in Hastings, a massive chimney stack collapsed onto the roof. It crashed through 3 floors, killing 1 resident. Another man was rescued after hanging onto a doorknob in mid-air. A woman was found alive on a mattress at the bottom.
We heard the voice of a lady in there, and I got her out about an hour later. But there was her husband was missing, and he was found 7 o'clock this morning.
An old church collapsed when its spire was ripped from the foundations. Many roads were blocked for hours by fallen trees. Thousands of acres of land were flooded, and tonight, damage to houses is being estimated in millions. Phil Roman, ITN, in the southeast.
An inquiry is underway at the Met Office tonight into why the storms weren't properly forecast. Weathermen have admitted their warnings came too late. Last night they knew of a warm air depression in the Bay of Biscay. It, mixed with cooler air surrounding it, lowering pressure and whipping up hurricane-force winds. The air mass drifted across southern Britain, causing the havoc.
There was no effective warning yesterday for the general public of a devastation that was about to descend on Britain.
Earlier on today, apparently, a woman rang the BBC and said she heard that there was a hurricane on the way. Well, if you're watching, don't worry, there isn't. But having said that, actually, the weather will become very windy, but most of the strong winds, incidentally, will be down over Spain and across into France.
The media get their information from the Met Office at Bracknell, where this central forecasting office analyses and forecasts round the clock. And senior Met men admit they were taken by surprise.
We were certainly taken by surprise by the exceptional nature of the storm. We had given some indication of the stormy weather which we were expecting 4 or 5 days ago, but when it came to the exceptional nature of the storm, clearly we underestimated it.
The Met men say the gales blew up exceptionally quickly and that they had no weather ships in the area to warn of what was about to hit Britain. David Rose, ITN, at the Met Office.
Insurance companies are bracing themselves for a host of claims worth millions of pounds, but they've told householders with policies that they are covered for most types of storm damage.
What they're not covered for is fences. Fences and gates they don't have cover for against storm. Everything else, there is insurance cover there. There will be a small amount to pay, probably £15 or £25. You will have to pay the first part of the claim. The rest of it is covered by storm, by falling trees, by accident breakage of glass sections. In your policy, there's no problem.
And now the rest of the day.
A trail of devastation across the south and southeast. Cost of the damage runs into millions of pounds, and in tonight's hour-long edition of Coast to Coast, we'll bring you reports from all around the region. 2 Dorset firemen died at Highcliffe, 2 people have been killed at Hastings, 2 seamen are missing off Dover. There's chaos in Brighton, one of many towns hit by widespread damage, and Shanklin Pier on the Isle of Wight has collapsed. Winds as high as 108 miles per hour were recorded through the night. At least 100,000 homes are still without power. Later, we'll talk to Southern Electricity about the problems they're facing, to the police about the chaos on the roads, and to legal and insurance experts about the cost of the damage. But first, the headlines from the south and southeast, and first, Fern Britain in the south.
In the south, 6 people are known to have died, some buried as their houses collapsed, others in cars hit by falling trees. The army has been called in to help get trains running again and to clear roads in Hampshire. 2 Dorset firemen died when a tree fell on their cab at Highcliffe. They were returning from an emergency call. Flats and houses along the south coast have been wrecked. There's been reports of looting at damaged stores in Southampton, Brighton and Portsmouth. Shanklin Pier on the Isle of Wight has collapsed into the sea, and an oil tanker has run aground at Hamble in Hampshire. 90 old people were evacuated when winds ripped the roof off their old people's home. And in Brighton, the Royal Pavilion is one of thousands of buildings to have suffered damage. And the roof of an electricity substation in the town has just collapsed and Brighton is now totally without power.
Here in the southeast, 7 people are feared dead. 300 families are homeless. 2 crewmen were killed when the Cypriot bulk carrier Sumnio sank outside Dover Harbour in 100-mile-an-hour winds. 1 cross-channel ferry is aground off Folkestone. Another's been stranded at sea since the early hours of this morning, with 150 passengers aboard. At Hastings, a man died when the roof of the Queen's Hotel collapsed. Nearby, a man was killed by roofing torn from a beach hut. And 3 people have been killed by falling trees, including a 50-year-old woman at Chatham whose home was crushed. Tonight, Kent Police have issued a series of flood warnings. That's serious flooding to come. Ironically, there's also a drought warning because of power cuts to water pumping stations. And there's also a leopard on the loose after a tree damaged its cage at Howlett Zoo near Canterbury.
There's a warning tonight that water supplies could be at risk, and we'll have more information on that later. But first, reports now from counties all across the south and southeast on the extent of the devastation. We go first to Mike Debbins in the southeast.
The gales hit the resort town of Hastings with tragic results. 2 people died, 1 a tourist buried under tons of rubble in his hotel bedroom. Mary Garn reports.
At the Queen's Hotel, hurricane-force winds tore off a chimney stack and sent it crashing through 3 bedrooms. An elderly couple on the bottom floor were trapped in their beds beneath all the rubble. It took firemen 4.5 hours to dig through tons of debris and recover the body of 70-year-old Ronald Davis, a tourist from Warwickshire. His wife Gladys was pulled clear and taken to hospital. Simon Corby was rescued from the middle bedroom after hanging on to what was left. The hotel director discovered the wreckage.
It was about 2:30 in the morning when 2 of my French windows in my flat were blown in. And I got up, to check through the hotel. And there was nothing extraordinary happening there, but I came to one point of the hotel where a gush of water came out, so I investigated it, and I saw a lot of rubble in that particular room, and also somebody shouting further up in the floors. So I went up there. There was a man hanging between the second and the third floor.
Holding on with his hands?
Holding on with his hands. So my assistant manager and the porter and I, we got him out.
And when did you discover that there were 2 other people trapped?
Well, I did a roll call right away. So I called everybody down to the lounge. And I checked which rooms were actually damaged, and I realized it was another room on the second floor. And there was a couple of them staying in there, and the room wasn't there anymore. So the fire brigade started searching for the people. They actually had contact with that lady, and they got out about an hour later, but we couldn't get any contact to the husband. And he was found about 7 o'clock in the morning.
The damage, which can't be seen from the outside of the hotel, is estimated at more than £100,000. Further along the seafront at Hastings Old Town, the winds tore down buildings. Fisherman James Reed died when he was trapped beneath this roof.
He just went one of the boats in, and I think he was walking along for a cup of tea. The wind got hold of this roof and just knocked him down and squashed him. Like they fell on top of him.
Did you realise at the time that anything had happened?
Well, no, till it come daylight, then somebody see him laying there. And he'd been laying there about 2 hours with all this wood on top of him.
Elsewhere in the town, one man had a lucky escape when part of his home collapsed. He realised the foundations were moving in the early hours and left the house. When he returned, the end wall had fallen away. As if the gales weren't enough, this caravan site at Coomhaven was hit by floods too. At least 20 caravans were blown over and badly damaged in the storm, to be left marooned in up to 3 feet of water.
In Dorset, 2 firemen died when a tree hit the cab of their fire engine as they returned from an emergency call. Residents had to be evacuated after the roof was ripped off an old people's home. Weymouth lifeboat rescued 6 people from a catamaran as a Royal Navy destroyer laid oil to calm the seas. And there was chaos on the county's roads, as Chrissy Pollard reports.
Firemen Ernest Gregory and Graham White had no chance. They took the full force of the tree as it fell on the front of the cab. 4 colleagues in the seats behind escaped with their lives. The 2 who died were trapped for an hour or more before heavy lifting gear arrived to free them. The fire engine was returning from an emergency call at 3 a.m. when, incredibly, the wind uprooted the tree at the split second the cab passed under it. Had it fallen a second later, no one would have been hurt.
I woke up with all the lights shining on the bedroom, and I went out by the window and had to look to see what was going on. There was just ambulances and fire engines out there. But it's very shocked. I just feel very shocked to think that 2 men were killed out there like that.
Well, we're desperately sorry. I mean, our main concern is for their families. They were both family men with children, and we are desperately sorry for them. And of course, all their colleagues will be very upset at Christchurch.
A second fire engine had to be called to cut them free. Ironically, it came out from their own station at Christchurch. Firemen there were said today to be shocked and distressed at the loss of the men. Ernest Gregory and Graham White, both in their 40s, each had more than 20 years long service with the Dorset Fire Brigade. The Mayor of Christchurch has launched an appeal fund for their families. The gale force winds devastated these old people's flats at Highcliffe. The whole of the flat roof was ripped off and debris scattered over surrounding gardens. 90 of the residents had to be evacuated in the middle of the night. Amazingly, no one was hurt. For many of the pensioners, the sight of their wrecked homes was just too much to bear. One of the residents explained what happened.
I heard a crack and a bang and something fell on my bed.
Yes.
And I got right under the bedclothes and right down and covered myself well over. And then this lady from the flat opposite appeared, and I said, come into the bed with me and get under the bedclothes.
All I remember is this is a terrific crash and everything rolling along the floor and along the hallway, it sounded like. It was a terrific crash.
Some of the old people have been taken in by relatives. Others are being rehoused by social services. Elsewhere in the county, scores of roads were blocked by fallen trees during the night. One unwary driver was taken completely by surprise. Workmen were out with chainsaws from First Light trying to clear major routes. JCBs had to be brought in to shift debris from around Highcliffe.
Heavy seas took their toll at Dover. A bulk carrier ship rammed into the harbour wall and sank. 2 crewmen died. 4 others were rescued by Dover lifeboat, but during the operation, the lifeboat's deputy coxswain suffered a heart attack.
The top of the mast is all that remains above water of the 1,500-ton Somnio, a Cypriot-registered ship, but with a British crew. After sheltering at Dungeness, she was swept back out to sea and sank near the harbour this morning. By late afternoon, the search for her 2 missing crew members was still being carried out by the Dover tug Deft, which was combing the harbour entrance. The other 4 members of the crew were taken to Buckland Hospital. 3 were released. The 4th, Michael Trainers, described as stable. The Dover lifeboat went to Somnio's rescue, but assistant coxswain Roy Cousins suffered a heart attack and was also rushed to Buckland Hospital, where his condition in the intensive care unit is now stable. By afternoon, the storm had abated, but one Dover Harbour Board official described weather conditions as the worst he'd known.
After the storm, it's been very bad. In fact, it didn't really start to subside until about 10 o'clock. And there was a very heavy sea running. But thankfully, as the tide dropped, the sea has reduced somewhat. Any seafarer or people connected with the sea always very sad at a situation like this. The ship carried a crew of 6 and only 4 have been accounted for. And obviously it's a very sad situation, and every effort will be made and is being made to recover the 2 missing people.
The port of Dover is still without power, but in the calm after the storm, a restricted ferry service has resumed.
Along the coast at Folkestone, the sealing ferry Hengist ran aground at 5 o'clock this morning. No passengers were on board, only 22 crewmen, when the 100-mile-an-hour gust caused her to break her moorings at Folkestone Harbour. The vessel hit a sea wall which gashed a hole 10 feet long and 8 feet wide. Firemen helped the crew off the stricken ship, and a new master and crew are now aboard as SeaLink decide how to make her watertight so she can be refloated on the next high tide within 24 hours. And 149 passengers were stranded on board a ferry for 12 hours outside Dover Harbour, as gales made it impossible for it to dock. The SeaLink ferry, St. Christopher, was on her way from Calais to Dover during the night, but only managed to dock early this afternoon. As a result of this and the beaching of the Hengist, SeaLink have closed Folkestone Harbour for 48 hours.
In Hampshire, a man died when a tree fell on his car. An oil tanker ran aground in Southampton water, and scores of people have lost their homes. As Graham Bowdner reports, the emergency services have been working flat out, and there's still plenty more to do.
The worst of the damage was on the coast as the storm swept in with terrifying force. This house at Barton-on-Sea was hit in the early hours of the morning while its owners were asleep. Later they told of their lucky escape.
There was all plaster falling down and so forth, and I looked in the one bedroom to the right and there was a big crack in the wall, so I just took one look and ran downstairs and woke my wife. I said, come on, let's get dressed. I said, we're on our way out. And just as we were running downstairs, we heard a rumble and the side of the building came down.
Nearby, the entire roof of a block of seafront flats was neatly removed. Inside, a scene of devastation, but there were no serious injuries. Along the coast at Hamble, an oil tanker, the Sam G, was swept onto the beach after being torn from its moorings at a nearby oil refinery. Tonight, efforts were being made to refloat her. Another ship in trouble was the car ferry Corbière, which docked at Portsmouth 6 hours late after a nightmare crossing from Jersey. Nearly half of the 103 vehicles on board were damaged, and passengers feared for their lives.
The boat was just going, seemed to go up in the air.
on its side, every way, and I just sat there holding my wife.
Quite frankly, I think most people felt they were lucky to escape with their life on that crossing. I'm not exaggerating, it was very, very severe.
At Southsea, another lucky escape for the owners of this house in the town centre. A chimney stack collapsed, sending tons of masonry into the kitchen of an upstairs flat. Nearby, a factory roof collapsed on a parked car, just one of hundreds of vehicles to be damaged during the night. In Southampton, the huge plate glass window of Allied Carpets in Commercial Road was literally sucked out. Even with the gale still at full strength, looters moved in, and one caller told police he'd watched a double bed being carried away. 2 men were later arrested. The huge dome roof of the Europa Tennis Centre, opened only last May, was completely destroyed. Damage is estimated at £100,000. Inland, the storm continued its trail of destruction, uprooting trees which had stood for 100 years. Scores of roads were blocked and the emergency services worked around the clock to get through to cut-off villages. At Petersfield, a motorist died when his car was crushed by a giant oak. And more structural damage at Waterlooville, where 2 houses were partly demolished. The elderly women who live there are now staying with relatives.
On the Isle of Wight, the major casualty was Shanklin Pier. Large chunks were torn away and scattered along the shoreline. Elsewhere, Yarmouth was cut off for a time by fallen trees, holiday caravans were turned over and sailing boats thrown ashore. The local MP has asked the Agriculture Minister to declare the island a disaster region. Anna Maria Ash reports.
Shanklin Pier was torn apart by the winds, at times gusting over 100 miles an hour. The structure, which is 98 years old, had its entire centre section swept away. The theatre and boat moorings were destroyed by the high seas. A complete amusement arcade full of gaming machines was dumped on the beach. Tons of other debris was left scattered along the shore. The pier was recently bought for £400,000 by a Southampton company. It had been due for a multi-million-pound refit to turn it into a major entertainment complex. Elsewhere on the island, Yarmouth was completely cut off for a time, as fallen trees blocked all the roads around the town. Sailing dinghies in the harbour were thrown onto the shore and wrecked, and holidaymakers were forced to take shelter as their caravans were overturned and badly damaged in the west of the island. Barry Field, the local MP, has asked the Minister of Agriculture to declare the island a disaster area. He said many farmers have lost their entire crop and will be ruined.
In Kent, it's been the same story of devastation, with the county virtually at a standstill at one stage. Falling trees killed a motorist. 2 other people died in their own homes. At Biddenden, a 45-year-old man was killed when a chimney collapsed through the roof. At Chatham, a middle-aged woman died under tons of falling masonry. Hugh Kirby reports.
A 60-foot-high beech tree crashed through the roof of the woman's house in Walderslade. 55-year-old Sue Schilling is thought to have died instantly as she slept in bed. Her body was recovered from underneath a pile of bricks, tiles and roof beams. Neighbours didn't even hear the huge tree come down amidst the howling storm.
Obviously, we had no idea of what had happened until we come out this morning to move my son's car off the drive in case the tiles fell off the roof on top of it. And that's when we saw the tree on the end of the house.
How was the woman found?
Well, I didn't personally go in. I was out getting a ladder at the time, but the neighbours broke the back window and got in. And apparently she was, all the rubble that was on top of the bed, they couldn't see the bed.
At nearby Rochester, hurricane-force winds ripped through a church as if it were made of matchwood. St Justus Church stood on this site for 31 years until the early hours of this morning, when it was destroyed in a matter of seconds. Working to salvage what little was left was the boiler-suited vicar. His congregation stood baffled and shocked. They'll be worshipping in the church hall this Sunday.
Well, I was away on a quiet retreat, of all things, and I just drove round the corner, having sort of knowing nothing about it at all, and saw it, and saw my folk obviously working away and getting on with the job. But for me, it was, well, just shattering, really, to see, because I had no opportunity to know anything about it at all.
St Justus is often referred to as the church on the hill, and it was exactly that exposed position that's destroyed it forever. On the Kent coast, hurricane-force winds tore through a caravan site near Folkestone. Families who lost their homes in the whirlwind are tonight staying in emergency accommodation in a village hall. On the roads, a scene of utter chaos. Lorries and cars blown over as many motorists ignored police warnings not to drive. One driver died when his car hit a tree on Detling Hill near Maidstone. Trees caused much of last night's damage. On the Kent-Sussex border, the 100-mile-an-hour winds cut a giant swathe through a forest. South of Maidstone, the River Belt burst its banks, floodwaters adding to today's chaos. And throughout Kent, families have spent the day surveying the damage to their homes. Few people have escaped. Workmen have been clearing trees from railway tracks, including the Dover to Canterbury line. British Rail say a massive clear-up of debris is needed before trains can return to normal. At Howlett Zoo near Canterbury, a search is underway for a leopard which escaped when a tree crashed through a safety fence.
And we'll have a report from Sussex and the damage there in just a few minutes. So widespread damage and disaster then across the south and southeast. The crucial questions now: when will electricity supplies be restored? Who pays for repairs to thousands of homes and factories? And have we seen the last of the gales? The answer to those questions from our studio experts and the latest weather forecast from Ron Loback right after this commercial break.
Everyone knows these men have to look clean and play dirty.
The sound of the chainsaw echoes right across the southeast of England as trees which have grown for hundreds of years as part of our landscape, our heritage, are sawn up, now little more than firewood. Trees planted by our ancestors, which have taken generations to reach their majestic maturity, were obliterated in a matter of minutes. Initially, it was thought that up to 1 million trees had been lost, but it's now believed that the final figure, which may not be known for years, will be many times that number. Oak and ash, beech and birch. The wind did not discriminate as it felled millions of trees in the southeast of England. For days, the chaos the storm caused prevented the true scale of the destruction becoming apparent. Today, the storm has slipped out of the headlines and off the front pages of the newspaper, as life for most of us gets back to normal. However, only now, 3 weeks after the event, is the stark reality of what has actually been lost slowly being revealed. It is now clear that this is much more than an environmental disaster. For many, it's a human tragedy too.
Well, we were literally stunned. I think this is the right word for it. I think everybody was absolutely shattered, just like the trees. We couldn't believe it. It was like a nightmare, and then we realised it wasn't a bad dream at all. It was reality. And we were
For Tony Schilling, 20 years of patience building up one of the foremost collections of trees in the world, his life work now lies in ruins. For fruit farmer John Waters, the 50 acres of orchard that was his livelihood has been demolished.
I felt it was a dream, and the more I look, the worse it got, and I still keep finding it gets worse each day, really. I just have lost confidence in the job, and I just don't feel that I want to start all over again.
Before the storm, Kew Gardens was a picture of elegance and order, one of the foremost collections of plants in the world. But the wind wrought havoc here as it did everywhere else. At least 500 trees have been lost, about 10% of the collection. Amongst the casualties, a fine turkey oak, which for a century has stood beside the lake, now lies in it. The tree of heaven was brought down by the wind, crashing irreverently through King William's Temple. The damage is depressing, but many of the collection's most prized possessions have miraculously escaped. The carefully controlled atmosphere of the temporary palm house was shattered by the cold wind when branches fell through the roof, but the swift action of the staff saved the collection, including the rarest tree at Kew, a member of the cycads family from Zululand, the only example in Britain.
How serious has the damage been here at Kew?
For Kew, very serious in the sense that we've never had such destruction at any one short moment in time, and it's about 15 years worth of loss in one night.
What in particular is the loss here? Is it aesthetic or scientific?
Well, the curious thing about the way the wind came is it came in high and it came in very fast, and it took all the tops out of the trees, or literally screwed them out of the ground, and it seemed to hit so many large trees. So you've got a matter of aesthetics and history, 200-year-old trees, trees which take several generations obviously to produce, and they form that structure of landscape, and it's that structure of landscape that's been broken here.
Are there any particular trees which you are very sad to lose?
Lots of old friends. Some I planted. I've been at Kew nearly 30 years now, so they're old friends. Other rare botanical ones, like there's a three-lobed malus, which to an ordinary visitor wouldn't look very much, but it happens to be very rare and one of the best trees of its species in cultivation. So yes, some special.
How much in money terms will it cost to put this right?
Couldn't put a price on it, really. How much is a tree worth that's taken 200 years? And an arboretum like this costs you perhaps £1 million a year to run. Spread that over 200 years in proportionate terms. The loss of 10% of those trees is priceless.
In the weeks which have followed the storm, it has become clear that Kew was actually quite lucky. But what of Wakehurst Place near East Grinstead in Sussex? This is the other half of the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew's country cousin, so to speak. Less well known, but equally important, and many believe even more beautiful. But this is how the gardens looked before the storm. 500 acres of magnificent trees and carefully nurtured flower beds. In its long and colourful history, dating back to the 13th century, it had probably never looked finer. Today, most of that elegance and beauty is just a memory. Wakehurst took the full brunt of the storm. In all, about half the trees have been destroyed. The skyline, which was once crowned with mature oaks, is now jagged and denuded. Not only have the trees themselves been lost, but many of the plants underneath have been crushed. Buried beneath this yew, however, an exotic rhododendron has managed to survive, in a cavern carved out of the twisted branches of the fallen tree. For the 30 staff, this is just the beginning of a long battle to restore the gardens to their former glory. Tony Shilling has spent 21 years in charge of Wakehurst, but in one night his life's work was destroyed.
Well, it's beyond my immediate comprehension. I couldn't believe it had actually happened. It was just like a sort of wild nightmare. The night itself was a nightmare, but to come down and see this sort of scale of devastation was just unthinkable. 50% of everything we've created has been smashed and obliterated in 3 hours. And 21 years of, you know, my passion for Wakehurst has just been put back to square one, really.
How much has been lost in scientific terms?
Well, I should think about 50% of the natural beauty and maturity of the garden's gone.
So how can you possibly, in yourself, start picking up the pieces and starting again?
Well, in some ways quite easily, because gardening is a constant challenge. So we've got that as a baseline, and this is an enormous challenge, so it's just amplified everything we were already doing. And we've got a disaster, but in itself it's a challenge.
It must be very difficult to think positively, though, when you see something like this, a huge tree just snapped off like a branch.
Right, the forces of nature. It's stunning, isn't it? But that's gone, that's history, and as soon as we start tidying up, we'll be into a planting programme and thinking about tomorrow.
So you can still be optimistic despite all this?
You have to be, there's no alternative.
So what are your priorities now?
Our first priority is to reopen the gardens to the general visitor.
How are you going to start clearing all this up there? I mean, it's devastated.
Yeah, well, it's a matter of peck. It's rather like painting the Forth Bridge, really. You just go from one rivet to the next when you're doing the bridge, and here we just go from one broken tree to the next, and eventually we're going to come out the other end, but it's going to take a long time. I don't
How
know,
long do you think?
2 years?
2 years?
That's a guess. It's a guess. It's so much, 500 acres, and it's just a guess. This used to be a sassafras, which is the name of the laurel family.
How long has it been here? I mean, how tall did it used to be?
It used to be about twice, maybe 3 times that height. It's been there perhaps 80 years.
Did it used to be very rare?
It's probably one of the rarest in the country. So rare, in fact, the Kew botanists could never really identify it precisely, and now we'll never know.
Look at this. What kind of tree is or was this?
This is a Californian redwood.
Will you be able to use timber from this?
Well, we've got a timber conversion unit here, and maybe we can, but getting the timber out is going to be very hard because this is a very, very attractive part of the garden. We've got to be very careful about not spoiling this wonderful lawn which is adjacent to it.
So this won't end up as a sofa?
Oh, I doubt it very much.
Wakehurst became part of the Royal Botanic Gardens in 1965. Since then, Tony Schilling, more than anyone else, has been responsible for its success. Today, he has every right to take its destruction personally. Specimens which he collected himself in the Himalayas now grow in the garden. His father's ashes are scattered beneath this shrub, grown from seeds he brought back from the mountains of Nepal. It survived, but around it, trees have fallen in all directions, snapped off like matchsticks by the 100-mile-an-hour winds.
Now, many trees are down, but as many again are very seriously damaged. How many of those will eventually have to come down, and how many will you be able to save?
Most of them will come down. I think we've got to be philosophical. If a tree is devastated and it hasn't got its beauty anymore, there's no point in keeping it there. And they will take a lower priority, obviously. First priority is clear up what's down on the ground. Second priority is to tidy up and get the visitor back in. And then the third priority is to sophisticate the management again.
What particular losses have there been? Which trees are you most sad to have lost?
I couldn't name one. There are lots which I'm equally as sad to have lost. And there's the largest pocket handkerchief tree probably in Great Britain in the gardens, or there was. That's now been crushed by a falling conifer. The silver lime in the courtyard of the mansion, one of those beautiful trees you could ever imagine, flat as a pancake, and the story just goes on and on.
This, in many respects, is your life work. You spent 20 years working here. You have, what, 7 or 8 years until retirement. Do you think you'll ever really get it back to the way you would want it to have left it?
I think the biggest frustration is I want to give it 7 years more in the same direction we were going, and that, of course, has gone, and there's going to be 2 years of negative tidying up, if you like, which takes another 2 years out. But, you know, you've got to think forwards, not backwards. The estate 20 years ago was in need of tremendous input, and we put in, and here we are now about to go back to the drawing board in many ways, because the challenge is a very similar one. It's a very different picture, but the problems are very similar. It's just that the devastation is very different.
Do you feel that you really are back to square one, that this is exactly the same kind of state as you found it in?
Oh no, it's worse, because it's difficult to put into words, I suppose, because we feel rudely interrupted. It's a silly thing to say, but we really do feel rudely interrupted because we were going so well. Over the years, we've created a well-managed garden and a great arboretum, and now we're back to a total different sort of chaos. It's not just neglect, it's Mother Nature raping the gardens overnight. 20 years of input was beginning to really escalate, and the more we were creating, the more it was showing. And now we've really been hammered very, very hard. It's hard to come to terms with.
What exactly is the role of Wakehurst? What's its purpose?
It's a living museum of plants. It's a botanical paradise. It's here for a number of reasons. The visitor comes for the natural beauty and for horticultural stimulation. The scientist comes for the study of taxonomy and botany. It's a wealth of interest, and it's like going for a walk around the world coming to Wakehurst.
How long do you think it'll be before it's like going for a walk around the world again?
When you lose a tree 250 years old, it's going to take another 250 years to get it back to that scale. But having said that, there are other trees which we are fast-growing. We can cut corners in certain directions, but overall, it's generations of stature we're talking about.
Trees are Tony Schilling's life work, his passion, and for visitors to Wakehurst, things of great beauty. But for thousands of fruit farmers in the southeast, trees provide a source of income, employment, a livelihood. If you look around many Kent orchards today, the phrase "the Garden of England" has a rather hollow ring to it. Hundreds of thousands of fruit trees have been lost, and the financial consequences for the farmers are grave. Since the storm 3 weeks ago, it has become increasingly evident that the damage in some areas is much more serious than it first appeared. Whole orchards will have to be grubbed up, the term farmers use for cutting down the trees and pulling the roots out of the ground. The loss of a crop is a disaster for any farmer, but for a fruit grower, the long-term repercussions are severe. Even when the new trees are planted, it will take at least 5 years before they bear fruit. That can mean 5 years without income. Even those trees which have not been destroyed have been severely damaged by the salt in the wind. This scorching, as it's known, will blight next year's crop. There is hardly a fruit tree in Kent which has not been affected, and it'll be the farmers and not the insurance companies which will carry the financial burden.
I can make no claim at all. You can't insure growing crops against storm damage, so this tree is a complete loss to me.
It's clearly had it. How much
Yes.
is it going to cost you to replace?
Well, a new tree with stake and tree guard and tree tie is going to cost about £4. Then there's the cost, obviously, the labour involved in planting the tree and the labour involved in removing the old one. And then, obviously, we've got to wait for a number of years before we get any fruit. So I think we could safely say that it's going to cost about £10 a tree to grub it and replant it, and loss of income as well.
And there are thousands like this all over your farm?
There are indeed, yes, yes. The damage to fruit orchards in the southeast runs to £10 million. So it's an awful lot of money is involved.
It's not just the trees which have suffered. Many farm buildings have been either severely damaged or destroyed by falling trees, and only about 1 in 10 is insured, pushing the final bill for David Simmons into tens of thousands of pounds. Coming to survey the damage is local MP Roger Moat, who has a number of fruit farmers in his Faversham constituency.
Do you think that there will be many farmers who will go to the wall?
One of the things that has impressed me about this type of community over the years is their determination to stay in business. It's a way of life for many people. It's been a struggle. They've fought pretty well everything, including every bit of competition that could be thrown at them. Very little government support, no price support on this type of product. They stay in business, and it's for the good of the country they do, and the good of the countryside that they do. So I am hoping that they will stick it out.
But a number of Kent farmers are finding that they will no longer be able to stick it out. The price of staying in business is just too high. On this farm near Maidstone, 90% of the orchard has been lost. On Thursday the 15th of October, John Waters ran a thriving fruit farm on one of the most desirable and fertile sites in the county. By Friday morning, however, it was a very different story.
Well, my wife was frightened of me going out on my own, so she said, well, I'm coming too. And I had to hold her by the arm, because between us we would have been blown over. It was a job to walk, so I thought, well, I better go and have a look at the orchards, and we were just horrified. I just couldn't believe it. I just was sort of dumbfounded. I just had to get somebody else to come and have a look, because I thought I was having a dream, and I just brought somebody else up to sort of say, well, look at it, and because I thought if I went and told anybody else what had happened, they just wouldn't believe me. In this orchard here, as you can see, it's 100% write-off. There's no question about it. But, there are a few trees standing, but it would be impossible to resurrect them. The time trying to shore the ones up that are still standing would be impossible to count the cost.
So of those trees which aren't actually out of the ground but are leaning over, will they die in due course?
Well, most of them will. Their roots are obviously damaged. We could stake a few of them, but unless one has got a 90% plant left behind, it's uneconomic to keep it. There's only one thing for this orchard in particular, is the bulldozer.
What will you personally do now?
Well, we've decided that we've finished with fruit growing. We're selling up, there's no question about it. There's no point in continuing. We've got overdrafts, like most other growers, and it would cost me at least £100,000 over the next 3 years to replant and to put it right. And I'm just not prepared at my age to start again, because that's really what it amounts to.
John Waters farms 50 acres of apple and pear trees, many of which he planted himself 15 years ago. Today, 45 acres of that orchard will have to be grubbed up and replanted. At 58, when John Waters could reasonably be expected to be looking forward to his retirement, he faces a disaster which has changed his life.
I liked the life and enjoyed growing, and when we started, we had a ready market for our fruit, and it was a joy to produce good fruit and a good way of living. Certainly the last few years it's got tougher and tougher. It's usually a better bet than to back horses or dogs or even gamble on the stock exchange, but this last year certainly the weather has been very unkind to us overall. We've had a lot of snow. We've also been hit by hail this year on part of the farm a few miles away, and been an extremely wet summer. It's made life very difficult as far as the strawberry going concerned, and well, this certainly was totally unexpected, and I just can't believe everything has sort of gone wrong in such a short period of time.
You're also an employer. What will happen to the people who you employ?
I feel very sorry for my loyal staff. I've got 5. One is a part-timer, but I've got 4 full-time employees. We used to employ more. We have cut down on our acreage over the last few years because of competition, and they unfortunately will have to find other jobs, or at least I hope they'll find other jobs.
You have 2 sons. Will either of those follow you into farming?
No, I think they've made up their own minds before this had happened. They certainly would have no intentions of farming after what they've seen happen here now. We know of others that are deciding that, you know, to call a halt the same as we are. Unless we get some government help, a lot of other growers may feel the same as I do.
John Waters' farm has been particularly severely hit, but he is by no means alone, and the National Farmers Union is not very optimistic about their chances of survival.
For people like John Waters who've lost 90% of their orchard, is there really any hope whatsoever? Do you have a single crumb of hope to throw them?
Well, clearly that is a catastrophe. It's a disaster, and where you've got a specialist business that is hit to that extent, with the long-term replacement. I mean, normally orchard replacement is done on a cyclical basis, a little bit at a time. A business cannot survive if it suddenly has to replace 90% of its orchards. And unless we can get some form of relief from a community disaster fund, to which government would help for those very hard-hit cases, the business must be in very severe jeopardy.
So the outlook for people like John Waters is pretty bleak.
It's very tough at the moment.
Faced with damage like this, John Waters has had little choice but to give up fruit farming and sell his orchards. But others are still teetering on the brink, fighting to stay in business. For them, the amount of financial help the government and the EEC provide could make all the difference between hanging on and going bust.
We've been doing a lot to try to assess what the damage is. I've just been very recently, I mean within the last few hours, having a discussion with Forestry Commission people who are doing this. And they're not actually yet in a position to say quite what the scale of the damage is, because there's an awful lot of clearing up and getting into the woodlands still to do. We've also announced various government initiatives to assist both local authorities in the clear-up and in my own department through the Farm and Countryside Initiative and in various other ways to guide and help farmers as they come to look at the damage. I'm also seeking to double the rates of replanting grant in the severely damaged areas under a European community scheme, but that is a community scheme and I have got to get agreement in Brussels, and I've been seeking that over the last 2 weeks and haven't yet had a response. So there's a lot we're doing.
There is a huge salvage operation. Now, I know in some cases there will be salvage value from the timber, and people have got to manage that carefully, because at the moment, inevitably, the market is incredibly weak. But even so, the actual physical business of clearing up cannot be underestimated. We know of one 900-acre farm that estimates that it would cost them £100,000 to clear up the mess. Now, a replanting grant of 50 or 60% even is not going to persuade that person to replant if he's spent all his resources clearing up the mess in the first place. I'm disappointed that the Minister feels that he can't give any help at all with clearing up the mess, because I do believe from the amenity point of view that if we're going to re-establish the beauty of the southeast, we need to get cracking with that as quickly as possible.
I think one point that I must make clear is that I think there's a general agreement that the government cannot compensate for insurable losses. That's clear. So what we're now looking at is the areas where things were uninsurable. Now, I can't actually say at this stage whether, and if so, what we'll be able to do. All I can tell you is that we are trying as fast as possible to assess what the scale of the damage is.
The clearing up is still going on in places like the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew and both at Wakehurst. That is going to cost an enormous amount of money over the years. Can they be sure that they will have the Ministry's support?
Well, they know already that we've agreed to put more money into, that's my responsibility, it's on my budget. And both of those organisations know that we've agreed to extra funding. But in fact, they tell me that the real problem at the moment is not extra funding, it's just clearing up.
But whatever financial assistance the government provide, it will not bring back the trees which have been destroyed. They have gone, and the southeast of England will never look quite the same again. But those who have lost the most are also the first to look to the future. Tony Shilling and his staff at Wakehurst are determined not to become sentimental. They have taken to counting the trees which have survived rather than those which were brought down. Even amidst all the splintered wood and broken branches of a fallen oak, there are the first signs of new growth. When this English oak was planted, Abraham Lincoln was President of the United States of America, Queen Victoria was still a young girl, and Lenin wasn't even born yet. This tree took over 100 years to grow, but in a matter of minutes it was destroyed, along with hundreds of others here at Wakehurst. But the cycle of birth, germination, growth and death is already starting all over again. Here we are, a small acorn which is already germinating. But by the time this acorn turns into an oak tree of that size, I'll be pushing up daisies. On the other side of the gardens, in an area where every single tree has been lost, work has begun planting trees for our grandchildren to enjoy. This is the first tree to be planted at Wakehurst after the storm, the first of many.
It is depressing, but I just feel, well, it's one of those things and we've just got to bear up, and it's no good crying about it. We've just got to take it and make the best of it, and something will turn up, I'm sure.
I'm very sad to have lost these Leyland cypress. They were put in as a windbreak 21 years ago. It's one of the first things I was personally involved in doing here when I first took up office, and so I feel a part of me actually is blown over as well as part of the garden. It's a very personal garden, this to me, and you know, I dearly love it, obviously, but when a tree like this comes down, it's one of the first things you ever did. It really does really smack you in the face very hard.
We feel confused, I feel confused, and so does my wife, and what our future is, at this moment, we just don't know. I still would like to do something in the farming world, but it won't be fruit growing. There's no question, I shan't change my mind. No, I won't grow fruit again.
Since the making of the programme, the government has allocated a storm damage recovery scheme. It has also
attempt to persuade the Secretary of State for Transport to refuse permission for their company to be sold. The men are unhappy about a decision by the City Council to sell the firm to the Isle of